wanatuua? Kwa nini wanatuua? Kwa nini wanatuua?
It is June 25th, 2024, Tuesday afternoon, outside Kenya's parliament in Nairobi. A young man named Rex Masai, 29 years old, a graphic designer, is shot in the thigh. This was during protests against the finance bill. He bleeds on the ground as people around him call for help. By the end of that day, multiple human rights groups report that more than 20 Kenyans are dead, most of them young, protesting economic policy. 18 months later, it is January 2026. Inflation is low. The shilling is stronger than it was at its weakest point. Foreign exchange reserves are up. The same government that deployed security forces onto the streets now points to economic stabilization as proof of progress. So, here is the question that we all are not allowed to skip. How do we hold these two realities at the same time? Is there a dissonance where economic indicators are improving and the signs are clear, yet on the other hand, citizens, the Kenyan citizens, dying during protests against economic policy? Before we accuse, before we defend, before we shout, we count. Karibu. I am your host, Kasisi Keriako Akenywa, and this is HESABU, counting.
Treat us like foreigners in this place. We are rejecting every single bill in that finance. We are rejecting it, every clause. We are not asking for any amendment. We are asking for them to reject it. The MPs have failed us. We are going to take power with our own hands, and we are not afraid.
Let us begin at the handing over of power. That is September 13th, 2022. Dr. William Samoei Ruto is sworn in as the Kenya's 5th president. According to the Central Bank of Kenya, the situation, according to the Central Bank of Kenya, the situation at that moment as the president was taking over the mantle looked like this. Public debt stood at approximately 10.4 trillion shillings. That's about 70% of the Kenya's GDP. Inflation. Inflation was running at over 9%, with food and fuel prices hitting households hardest, and everything else hitting the roof. At that point in time, and we have to be careful here because these are the real numbers, the shilling at the time was trading at roughly 120 to the US dollar. All that was at the time President Ruto was taking over the government. At the same time, more than half of government revenue was going to debt servicing. By the way, these are not political talking points. They are physical facts. Kenya, as a country, and its government was spending more on interest in payment of loans than on development. Now, because context matters, as we all know, and everything depends on context, not how you see it, not on opinions, but exactly how things were and the reality. And as we say, numbers and reality do not lie. The then deputy president of the entire nation for 10 years, a whole decade, was none other but yours truly, William Samoei Ruto. All this time, for the 10 years, the debt was being accumulated. He was part of the presidency. And at the same time, the presidency, which is a constitutional authority and final borrowing decisions, rested with President Uhuru Kenyatta. That's another fact. We cannot deny that. That even though William Ruto was part of the presidency as the deputy, the constitutional mandate of how much was going to be borrowed, where was it going to be borrowed, and who was going to sign out these debts was actually President Uhuru Kenyatta. So, here, responsibility is actually shared, but not identical. And that distinction matters, and we will return to it later in this series and also in upcoming series. For now, what matters is this. By September 2022, Kenya's fiscal space was already severely constrained. That distinction matters, and we will return to it in this series and upcoming series. But for now, what matters is this. By September 2022, Kenya's fiscal space was already severe. During his campaign to become the 5th president of Kenya, President Ruto, the then deputy, promised a bottom-up economic model, the hustler nation, as he called it. The goal was that he was going to lower cost of living. That's a promise he made. He promised the hustler nation relief for ordinary households, support for small traders and workers, including the boda and mama boga, as he would always say. But what followed was more complicated. With the first year, new statutory deductions were introduced, all expanded. Number one, the housing levy, which of course was going to affect the working class. Higher National Social Security Fund contributions. the transition to the Social Health Insurance Fund, which was going to increase and at the end of the day, increased payroll deductions. For many of those who are salaried Kenyans, take-home pay for many salaried Kenyans, take-home pay shrunk even as prices remained elevated from earlier inflation as mentioned. In the midst of all this, and remember the promises, and remember the background in which President Ruto's government, whatever President Ruto government was inheriting, then came the infamous Finance Bill of 2024. The proposal now included new or expanded taxes affecting basic goods and services. Things like bread, sanitary products, mobile money transactions, items woven into people's daily life. A generation that had largely stayed away or stayed outside formal politics. A generation that had largely stayed outside formal politics responded. The Gen Z. These are young Kenyans who organize themselves across platforms, largely without any party or political structure or ethnic mobilization. Their message was clear and simple, that the burden felt excessive and the process felt disconnected from lived reality. So, protests began peacefully in mid-June. By June 25th of the same year, the Parliament of Kenya passed the Finance Bill. And as a result, demonstrations escalated. Police were deployed, and they used crowd control measures, including tear gas, water cannons, and rubber bullets. And some cases report live bullets. Evidence from medical reports, videos, and eyewitnesses evidence from medical reports, videos, and eyewitness accounts confirms that live ammunition, unfortunately, was also used upon young Kenyans, and multiple protesters died. On June 26, the president addressed the nation and announced the withdrawal of the Finance Bill. However, in subsequent months, slowly and quietly, several revenue measures found themselves back, and they reappeared in revised form through other legislations that the same parliament that had passed the previous finance bill brought onto the floor. Of course, this created a perception gap. From the government's viewpoint, fiscal necessity continued. But from the public viewpoint, the concession felt partial, even cosmetic. That gap matters a lot in this discussion and in upcoming series, because trust, as we know it, worldwide, is an economic variable too. This gap matters because trust is an economic variable too, and it matters. And once you lose trust, public trust, it's very difficult to convince people that there were no other ulterior motives in the cosmetic changes that were made and some of the concession that happened in the parliament, even though the president had withdrawn the finance bill. And this is where now this conversation gets uncomfortable and tricky, because some in the government claims this is where the conversation gets uncomfortable, because some government claims are supported by data. For example, inflation fell significantly, reaching below 3% by the late 2024. And according to the Kenya National Bureau of Standards and Africa Check, this drop was evident and it was well documented. The other example as to why these spaces now becomes quite, you almost feel the dissonance in the whole structure of things, is the foreign exchange reserves. That rose to approximately $9.5 billion, providing about 5 months of import covers. Meaning that if the economy was to chart at that moment in time, the Kenyan government would have been able to cover for 5 months without borrowing, because of the kind of money they had accumulated through foreign exchange reserves. The GDP of the country, again, grew in 2023, exceeding the average African level or different nations' GDP. These are real improvements in macroeconomics indicators. However, macro indicators do not reset household balance sheets. We all know that. Yeah. If the common mwananchi is not feeling these macroeconomic movements, if they're not affecting in a positive way their pockets, then something is not going to be received well. The Chelling story, for example, illustrates this very clearly. By early 2024, the shilling against the dollar weakened sharply. This is now as President Ruto is seated in the office as the president of the country, reaching historic lows. Of course, it later recovered, and that recovery matters too. but it does not erase the period of depreciation that saw raised prices and eroding purchasing power for the common mwananchi. This is why I'm saying there's quite a dissonance. And because we are not here to, to do any blame game, we're trying to count. We are trying to HESABU. We are trying to see, where did the rain start beating us? Can we do better? Low inflation today, of course, does not undo high inflation yesterday, because rent does not reverse that. Last year when the inflation was low, rent was at $100. And then this year the inflation is high and the rent goes up to $200 or 200,000 Kenyan shillings. It will not go down after that. School fees for our children, they do not retroactively adjust. So they remain high. And these are the basics that affect the common mwananchi. Payroll deductions do not disappear. They stay on your payroll. So we arrive at a paradox, my friends. Technically, stabilization is happening. Practically, many households still feel betrayed. They feel worse off. And they feel that something is out of balance. And this is why when you walk into any household today in Kenya, majority of people, and particularly those who are working in the middle class people, they will tell you how much they feel the pain. So both statement of economic improvement, yet this other situation where everybody is feeling the pain, can be true. Ignoring either one of these distorts the reality. So claiming economic advancement, economic improvement, and denying the reality of pain, the reality of prices, the reality of these other things that people are going through, it definitely distorts reality. And I think this is a conversation as Kenyans we need to continue having. And we need to continue asking ourselves. Because I feel that we should put away our differences. We should put away this political, chest beating and ask ourselves about the future of the country. Let's turn to the Kenyan's public debt now, that stands at approximately 11.5 trillion shillings. This is quite an increase of about 1.5 trillion shillings under President Ruto's government. Some of this increase reflects refinancing, of course, rather than fresh spending. It includes Eurobond restructuring, and that distinction also matters. But so does transparency. What remains unclear is how much new borrowing has translated into identifiable, completed projects, such as roads, dams, electricity installation, clinics, schools, agricultural improvement, among others. Things becomes even murkier because, on one hand, the government says investments are being made. And of course, we have seen some of these, and we'll be talking about them later, things like housing and so forth. But on the other hand, the nation a majority of Kenyans, ordinary Kenyans, citizens, are asking for itemized proof. And I don't think this is cynicism. I think this is learned caution from the citizenry. Kenya has been here before. And so in episode 3 of this series, we will attempt something specific, trying to trace borrowing since September 2022 against visible outputs. And this is where I'm calling out all other Kenyans to, instead of, all this sloganeering and fighting without any meaning and without any direction and without helping the country, that we need to trace and look at the facts, what is being presented to us, go get details because these numbers are out there, and then put them forward to the nation and to the public, and you make your case. So, for us, we are not here to accuse. We are neither here to absolve. We are here to account. Because we need to understand the dynamics between the state power and the human cost. How much of it can we credit this, economic advancement? And then how do we talk about it in face of human cost? And this forces me to return to June 25th, where we already know at least 23 Kenyans died, young people. Of course, we know that there is no consolidated official list, neither from the government or even from the public. We also know that there is no completed public inquiry as we have had in the past. We have not seen any prosecutions announced as of early 2026. We have not had anybody being taken to court or being charged for the murder of 23 Kenyans, young people, Gen Zs. It is established, as we have seen, that live ammunition was used during the protests against the finance bill. What remains unresolved, and this is where the state power and human cost come into play, what remains unresolved is the command in responsibility. How high did that command go? How high did that command go? In a country where we have known for years that command have sometimes come from the highest office in the land. Were the decisions made by the directing police officers and their, using their authority on the ground, or were there authorization from higher up the chain? And this does not necessarily mean that it could have necessarily come from the president, but we are just talking about, Kenya is a complicated space, and we all have to agree about this. Because sometimes we may be blaming a group of people, yet another group of people are the ones who are directly responsible of these things. So we have to be careful here. But those answers matter to us because democracies are judged not only by economic performances, but by how the state uses force against its own citizens. The minute that starts happening, where force is being applied upon the citizens for no apparent reason, then we cannot assume intent. Neither can we ignore the consequences. Economic stabilization cannot be discussed in isolation from the human cost of enforcing policy. That's what we are saying. That state power and its limit upon human cost is very important. That tension is real, and we know it. Avoiding it does not make it disappear. What happened during the Gen Z protest and what is happening right now on the economic spaces, these things cannot be ignored, but they all matter to the nation. So, as we come to a close, this is where we stand. We're here at Radio Kenya United at this beginning of the new year. That 3 years into Ruto's presidency, Kenya as a nation and as a republic shows signs of macroeconomic stabilization. But this is alongside deep public frustration, unresolved death, and unresolved trust. This season of HESABU, counting, is not a verdict. It's a process. We will count the gains, that is for sure. And that's what we'll continue doing here at Radio Kenya United. But also, we are going to count the costs. The gains, the cost. The gain, the cost. We will also count the names of the loved ones that we have lost. Because accountability begins with clarity. If there's no clarity whatsoever, then we cannot say that we're being accountable to each other. So, HESABU is basically going to do that. And this is what we are promising to do for the coming episodes. So, our next episode, episode number 2, will be upon wale waliofariki. The young ones who died. That's what we'll be focusing on. The names, circumstances, what we know, and what remains unanswered. This is what we shall be dealing with. Our next episode is titled Wale Waliofariki. The ones who died. Names, circumstances, what we know, and what remains unanswered. This is HESABU, counting. Tunahesabu matokeo, one after the other. Situonane, jameni. Thank you. Happy New Year.